So I grew up in a community pasture north of Peace River, and I lived there for quite a while. We were affectionately known as bushed, because we literally were 16 miles at the end of the road, and there was nothing behind us. And it was not atypical for us to have things like cougars and bears and things walk through our yard, and you know, my local veterinarian set my arm when it was broke and things like this. So we definitely, yes, we definitely had kind of our own way of life. And I joined agriculture a month before BSC struck in 2003. And what an eye-opener. Honestly, what an eye-opener. Because not only did I see agriculture from a different perspective, not just what I was used to as a community pasture or cow-calf operation, but just the sheer impact it had across the province. So traceability, you could say, has its foundations there. And what I'm going to take you through today is a quick discussion about why we do traceability, why we want people to do traceability, what it is, what's behind it, because it's very important to understand that traceability is bigger than Alberta, and it's bigger in Canada. And then I think what's most important, or second most important, is talking to you about what's involved in traceability and how do we use it. So what do you as professionals in your community need to know to tell your colleagues as to why it's important? So I'm going to stop periodically to answer questions. And if there's a question you ask that I'm going to deal with later, I'll just politely ask you to hold that question, because I think there's a pretty tight timeline and we've got a lot to get through. So livestock traceability and why it's important to you. So what is traceability? A complete, robust system of traceability consists of three parts. You've got crop traceability, livestock traceability, and food processing traceability. It is the flow of information amongst those three parts. Most of us affectionately refer to it as farm to fork, gate to plate. I was talking to a lady earlier today who said, I bought a bag of chickpeas and I could enter the code and it told me exactly where the chickpeas came from. And I'm like, that's traceability. So that's what we're talking about today. We're going to focus on livestock traceability. And livestock traceability is literally the ability to track an animal or a group of animals, be it livestock or poultry, throughout their lifetime, moving backwards and forwards. This gets a little bit complex depending on the type of species we're dealing with, because they each have their own production cycles. So today I'm going to focus mainly on beef and swine. But by all means, if you have other questions, either ask me today or during the session, or come to the booth and I'll do my best to answer them. And if I don't know, I'll smile and say, can I get your number? And I'll get back to you on it. Traceability, as I said earlier, is bigger than Alberta and it's bigger than Canada. It actually has foundations in the international community. For example, the World Trade Organization has an interest in traceability. It is related to the United Nations, but it's not part of the UN. So for those of you that are interested in the economic part we're going to talk about briefly, that's a consideration. Pardon me. The other organization is Codex Alimentarius. This is part of the UN. It's through the World Health Organization, and it's the international food standards. So in theory, I buy a Twinkie here, I buy a Twinkie in the US, I go to Europe. The quality should be there, yes? The standards should be there. This is something that these folks look at. The third one that you are probably most familiar with is the OIE, or the World Organization for Animal Health. Now they have a very strong interest in traceability, and they've created general principles on traceability that we actually embrace and we try to follow, starting at the national level. Nationally, we have something called Canadian Traceability, or the National and they have the National Agriculture and Food Traceability System, or NAFTS. NAFTS' purpose is to identify a traceability system for Canada that has effective tools that work for the protection of animal health, public health, and food safety. A lot of producers sometimes don't remember that they are raising food, right? And that's something that traceability helps address. A good traceability system with its tools can help reduce response times, which can limit economic, environmental, and social impacts of emergency situations, like disease outbreaks. We're going to talk more about emergency situations, but that's an important one because it has a very huge impact on the communities that we service. NAFTS has a number of priority species. So all the bovines, beef, dairy, and bison, swine, sheep, goats, farm to cervids, which typically in Alberta is elk and reindeer, all equine, and poultry. We deal with commercial and non-commercials, so for those of you that are near urban areas, all those little backyard flocks that are popping up, those are ours. All those little Vietnamese potbelly pigs that people are bringing in as pets, we want them in the system because they have an impact. So across Canada, efforts are being made by all the provinces and territories to bring traceability systems for these priority species. NAFTS provides assurance, and it's really important that you catch the word assurance and not think of it as insurance. I had a conversation with a very savvy producer about 2 years ago that changed my entire perspective on this word. And the assurance that NAFTS provides, or traceability, relates to industry competitiveness, market access, consumer confidence, and emergency management. It is not an insurance program that provides money back. What it does do is it provides assurance that our product is good. Assurance that we can follow through and identify the animals we need to identify. And we're going to talk about this a bit more as we go through. So let's start with industry competitiveness. If you travel across Canada, if you travel across North America, we are known as having a good product, yes? Made in Canada. Canadian milk. People look at that and go, this is good. We trust it, and we want to buy that. Market access. Canada and Alberta are export-based markets. We are known of producing a lot of raw resources. We don't have the capacity at this time, and maybe we don't even have the sheer number for consumption to finish processing all of it. So the reality is we export raw resources. We access a lot of markets. As a matter of fact, we access over 80 markets just on syn meats or offal alone. We're going to talk a bit more about the money. Some of our key industries that we compete against, or our key markets, are Australia. They have something called National Livestock Identification System. Brazil, and US is now starting to implement something on a state-by-state basis. It's not as robust as what we have, but it's starting to build. And for those of you that travel to Mexico, the state of Chihuahua has a paper-based traceability system that is fully functional, and Botswana has one. So we are competing with countries we've never had to compete with before because they have the assurance that their product is good. When we're providing markets, we need to ensure we have production capacity. I can't tell you I'm going to deliver you a bucket of apples every week if I don't have enough apple trees, right? No different. In Canada, one of our largest food service providers requires 64 million pounds of traceable beef a year. They're based in central Alberta. That's a lot of money that stays in Alberta, from the moment it's a cow-calf operation all the way through to production. I personally would much rather have that money in our province than going somewhere else. If we cannot provide that traceable beef, they will look elsewhere because of their food safety standards and their commitment to provide assurance to their consumers. I like this slide. My data is a little bit dated, but what I'd like you to take away from it is, if we slaughtered 100 beef cattle in Alberta today, 15 would be consumed in Alberta. Excellent, right? Considering all the protein products that we're competing against. 50 would be consumed in the rest of Canada. 35 would be exported worldwide. Out of the 35 we export worldwide, their largest destination is US, Mexico, Hong Kong, Japan, and then 40 other countries that accept our product. China is one of those 40 other countries, but since their GDP has increased, they're actually starting to go away from some of the smaller meats, like the lesser nice cuts, and they're starting to buy the better cuts. That's marketing, that's business. What I think is important for you to take away from this is that we actually exported in 2011, including our edible offal, right? We exported almost $1 billion worth of meat products. That is huge. And it's much better coming to our economy than someone else's. Consumer confidence. So I mentioned I started working Alberta agriculture a month before the 2003 BSC situation. At the time, we took a picture of this magazine, and to be honest, we didn't fully understand what was happening at the time in terms of the long-term implications. And we thought, wow, this is amazing. But I show this to you now because this is what a large part of the world and a large part of our country saw. Mad cow disease. First of all, don't call it that, right? But second of all, what a horrible, horrible image. How many of you were involved in the industry in 2003? Quick show of hands. Okay, so most of the people in the room. The program area I started with handled the payments, handled the phones, handled the letters that came in. If you think back to 2003, we had excessive moisture in some parts of the province, insufficient moisture in other parts. You want me to move away, don't you? And then, of course, we had this, which not only impacted cattle, it impacted a lot of the other priority species. I do remember taking a phone call one day, and it was from a gentleman from central Alberta, and he's tough, right? He's been in this business a long time, and he was, by the 5 minutes into the phone call, he was in tears. He's like, my family has to leave to go to Saskatchewan, my wife and kids, because she needs to go there and work, and I'm trying to make things work here, and I can't take care of the kids, and they still need to go to school. He said, I've had to send 2 trailers of cattle in, and I've got maybe a few dollars for each of them. I have no feed. And I went out to do my combining because it was so wet. He said, I was like, that's it, I still have to go, I need something. And he's like, I got my combine stuck. I drove out to pull it out myself because everyone's busy, and I pulled my brand new combine in half. How much more can one person take? 2 weeks later, I learned he committed suicide. I've met other producers that have had purebred herds that were part of the traceback, but because they didn't have a system like Traceability, their entire purebred and or commercial herd has been completely wiped out. Closed herd, they had raised it for generations. Inherited some of the cattle from their grandparents, from their dad, right? Everything they'd been working for is gone. We were one of the lucky places, despite all that. There is enough consumer confidence in the products that producers, that we raise, our family raises, your clients, that the consumers didn't turn their back on us. They ate more. They rallied and ate more beef, to the point where we were starting to say, for God's sake, stop eating steak. Can you eat some hamburger, right? Because we're having to import hamburger. So traceability plays a role in assuring to our consumers that what we create is good. It also plays a role in supporting our producers in their business so that they don't lose everything. And I think that's very critical, especially after being on the receiving end of those emails and phone calls for about a year. I love this picture. Big enough to supply, small enough to service. This is XL's food website. Beautiful, right? Great image. You look at it and go, that's awesome. Everyone remember what happened at XL Foods? This is their product. Perfectly good meat for the most part, but no one wanted to touch it. We can have an argument as to why all those things happen. Some people say it's how they handle the media. Some people say it's a whole bunch of other things, but the point is, this is what happened. There wasn't consumer confidence in the product, and there wasn't confidence in not just XL Foods, but it was much bigger, right? This is what we try to avoid. This is what we work together with our industry to avoid. Emergency management. So emergency management, if you think about the 4 elements, is perhaps the most appealing in the sense that it's interesting and people really think about it. They wrap their heads around it. Emergencies can happen at any time. As you can see, it can be a natural disaster like a fire or a flood or a technological disaster like a pipeline breaking or something. can also be disease. We're going to talk about this more later in terms of how traceability is used in these situations. I do want you to take a look at this picture though. You can see how close the flames are to the cattle. When the fires happened in Slave Lake, some people had an hour's notice to pack up what they needed and to take care of their farms. If you had an hour's notice, what would you do? Where do you start? With traceability, we can often give you more than an hour. So the fires I was talking about, this is a flood in 2013, 2014. I got to work down in the flood area on emergency response. That is a dairy farm. As you can see, it's fully submerged. Those of you that deal with dairy know you can't just turn the cattle loose and let them go like you can with a lot of species and bring them back later. So we work with them to try and help them find alternative transport methods because a lot of the trailers they'd normally use are gone. They're busy and they need a milking barn or something similar. And of course, disease. So before we go on and talk about what traceability is based on, are there any questions on what we just went through? No? I've wowed you all? I recognize a few faces from the trade show that I've talked to over the last few days. Okay, so traceability is based on 3 pillars. These are the fundamental pillars of traceability anywhere in the world, anywhere. The first one is premises identification, or PID, and we're going to talk about that. The second one is animal identification, which is a unique identification of animals, either on their own or as that homogeneous group, again, depending on their production process. And animal movement, which is literally the ability to track the movement of animals from premises to premises. So these are 3 areas we are very important with, or very much involved in, that are important. PID is completely the responsibility of the government of Alberta, implementing what we need to meet the NAFTS. A lot more species than the priority species, which we're also going to talk about. Animal ID and animal movement, depending on the priority species we're dealing with, we will engage with different industry groups. Obviously, for animal ID, we work with CCIA when it comes to all of the bovines and sheep. And for bovines and sheep, we deal with LIS for movement. But for swine, it's Alberta pork. So we have a lot of working relationships with industry and delegated authorities. And for those of you that don't necessarily know what a delegated authority is, it's a body or an entity that has been given the authority to implement and enact and support a group of regulations for the province or the feds.